The bat-wing doors of the Golden Horseshoe crash open, and in staggers Luke Morrison, boots heavy, spurs chiming dull against warped floorboards. Smoke hangs so thick you could carve your initials in a cheap whiskey. Old sweat, the tired breath of men who've been running from themselves since sunup. It's well past midnight in Cheyenne Creek, Wyoming territory, and the saloon is still alive. Glasses clink. Someone laughs too loud. A piano hammers a tune 3 notes shy of in tune. Luke's got those blue eyes that usually see trouble coming a mile out, but tonight they're cloudy with drink. 28 years old, long and raw-boned, skin round by 1,000 miles of sky. Black hair falls out from under a battered Stetson, shirt dusted with trail and stained with whiskey. He plants a palm on the bar to stop the room from tilting. "Morrison!" booms Jake Hartley from a corner table where the real night is happening. "Get over here. This game needs fresh money." Luke hesitates. He's been pouring whiskey over a loneliness that won't drown, but pride is a mule that doesn't listen. He fishes his last 20 from a vest pocket 1 month's wages from Patterson's spread and drifts toward a table full of familiar wolves. Jake Hartley, cattle big enough to measure in towns. Snake Eye Sullivan, slick gambler with iron-gray eyes and hair greased back like a Pronus. And Samuel Blackwood, the banker who plays at being common when his wife's not watching. "Deal me in," Luke says, dropping into the empty chair. Snake Eye smiles the way a fox smiles at a chicken coop. Luke Morrison in the flesh. "Can you even see straight, cowboy?" "Straight enough to rake your pot," Luke slurs, though the words slide together. Cards whisper, chips clatter. For a while, luck sits in Luke's lap purring. He bluffs when he ought to fold and raises when he should have prayed, and somehow the cards keep landing face up in his favor. The pile in front of him fattens. His grin loosens, and the whiskey makes everything feel easy. "Lady Luck's finally writing you letters," Blackwood drawls, dabbing sweat with silk. "About time," Luke fires back, but nights are long, and bottles get empty. Luck, a fickle old cat, hops down and wanders. Luke's stack thins, then vanishes. By 3 in the morning, he's lost it all. Cash, saddle, rifle, the horse he rode in on. He shoves back from the table, hollowed out. "I'm done." "Now, hold up," Snake Eye purrs. "A man doesn't just walk away when he's been kissing fortune all night. I'll spot you 100. 1 hand. Winner takes all." Everything in Luke, everything that's kept him alive on bad trails and worse days, whispers walk. But whiskey turns whispers into background noise, and pride stands up straight. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Snake says, palms up, voice smooth as oiled leather. "Just a little condition. You lose, you do one thing I say. Nothing illegal, just entertainment for Cheyenne Creek." Hartley chuckles. "Careful, Morrison." He calls rattlesnakes entertainment. $100 would set Luke close to the little place he's been dreaming about, a patch of grass, a couple milk cows, something with a fence and a sunrise that belongs to him. He nods. Deal. Word flows through the room like spilled rye. Men crowd close, breath hot, faces hungry. Snake Eye deals with a flourish. Luke lifts his cards, 2 pair, kings and sevens. Not a barn burner, but nothing to sneeze at. He draws 1. A 7. Full house. His heart kicks. He shoves the borrowed money in. All of it. Those gray eyes across from him flicker. Snake counts the bet and slides his own stack forward. "Show," someone calls. Luke lays them down, 7s over kings. And for a heartbeat, the saloon goes quiet enough to hear your doubts. Then Snake Eye laughs. Not a kind sound. He fans his own hand. 4 queens, the kind of insult only cards can manage. You lose. Cowboy. Blood drains right out of Luke's face. Money's gone. Gear gone. horse gone. And now his debt comes due. About that condition, Snake says, striking a match, taking his time to light a cigar. You know the widow out by Copper Creek? Luke nods. Everybody knows Amara Johnson. Young, proud, 6 months widowed when a mine swallowed her husband. Keeps to herself and fights the land single-handed. You're going to marry her. The room erupts hooting. Boots on planks. The wild, ugly joy of men who've got someone to point at. Luke sobers in a snap. You can't be serious. Dead serious, Snake says. Or was your word just for show? Luke's jaw tightens. Out here, a man's word is a brand you carry on your soul. Break it, and you might as well change your name. She won't agree, he manages. Blackwood clears his throat. Oh, she will. I hold her note. Either she's Mrs. Morrison by week's end, or I foreclose. Papers are ready. Luke's stomach drops. He sees it now. The trap wasn't a spur-of-the-moment joke. It was built for him. Why? He asks. What's the game? Snake blows a smoke ring at the ceiling. Certain parties want that land. This way, everyone's entertained. Blackwood gets his inch or a mile, and Luke Morrison learns what it feels like to be tied to someone beneath. The laugh that follows is meaner than the first. Luke looks at the faces in the circle. Small men ballooned by cruelty. He stumbles outside into the cold pre-dawn and leans on the hitch rail, swallowing bile. One stupid night, and he's wrecked an innocent woman's life with his own. 3 days later, there's a crowd crammed into the little clapboard church at the edge of town. Luke stands at the front, sober as a judge and twice as pale, wearing his one clean shirt. The door opens and conversation drops a key. Amara Johnson walks in on Reverend Mills's arm. Moonlight meets iron when she moves simple blue dress, darned with care. Hair drawn back clean. Eyes deep as river water and sharper than most men's wits. Her back is straight. Her chin is up. She is nobody's entertainment. Miss Johnson, Luke whispers when she reaches him. I'm sorry. Save it, she says, voice low, steady. We both know what this is. Let's end it quick. Reverend Mills rattles through vows like the words burn his tongue. When he asks for objections, the church roars laughter. No objections, someone crows. Best show in years. Amara doesn't flinch. Luke feels something move in his chest he hasn't had since he was a kid. Respect. When the Reverend says man and wife, the bell clangs out like mockery, echoing across the valley. They turn. For a breath, their eyes hold. Not romance, not even close. But a flicker of understanding passes like a match strike on dry kindling. We didn't choose the rules. And here we are anyway. Luke offers his arm. She hesitates, then takes it. He leans in so no one else can hear. Cowboy lost a bet, got forced into a Western love story neither one of us asked for. Maybe the game's not over. She studies his face for the sneer that isn't there, then gives him the smallest possible nod. The wedding night brings a wind that finds every crack in Luke's cabin. He built the place himself 3 years back and never planned on bringing a bride through its door. 1 bed, pot-bellied stove, a table that lists like a tired mule, shelves with a few chipped dishes, a sack of flour, coffee if you're generous. It's not much, Luke says, lighting the lamp. Yellow flame licks the walls into life. I've seen worse, she answers, setting down a carpet bag, the kind of bag you pack when you aren't given time to choose. Silence sits down with them. Luke stirs the stove. She stands near the door, arms folded tight. I'll sleep in the barn, he blurts. You can take the bed. No, she says, firm as fence posts. People are waiting for us to fail. We won't feed them extra stories. Even in lamplight, even in a mended dress, Amara carries herself like a queen who hasn't been told the world thinks otherwise. Why'd you agree? He asks. You could have fought Blackwood. A slant of a smile without any joy in it. A colored widow fighting a white banker in Wyoming territory? How do you think that ends, Luke? He doesn't have a lie big enough for that truth. He lays blankets by the stove. She opens her bag with careful hands. A Bible, a silvered brush, a small photograph, and a quilt hand-stitched pattern like nothing Luke's ever seen. You make that? He asks. My mama taught me. Her palm smooths the fabric. Her mama before her. African patterns traveled far and changed a little each stop. It's fine work, Luke says, honest for the first time tonight. My ma quilted, but I never saw designs like those. It's the first real piece of herself she gives him, and it's gone a moment later. They make ready for bed like strangers trapped in a stagecoach, each aware of the other down to the sound of breathing. Mr. Morrison, she says in the dark. Luke, he answers. Might as well use first names. We're stuck with each other. Luke, she replies carefully. I won't be forced a second time. This marriage may be law, but I am not a prize to cash in. I understand, he says quickly, grateful not to stumble the wrong way. We'll figure a way through with our heads up. Dignity, she murmurs, and he hears a lifetime in that single word. Morning smells like coffee and decisions. Luke wakes to fire popping and biscuits baking. Amara moves the way folks move who've had to pull more weight than they should. You didn't have to, he begins. I pay my way, she says, not looking up. They eat quiet. He notices she takes the smaller portion, like she's been rationing longer than this marriage has existed. We need supplies, he says. And you need clothes for winter. We'll ride to town. I have what I need. No, he says, gentler than he feels. By the law, you're my wife. That means what's mine is yours. If folks want to stare, let them get a good look. She studies him as if he's a word in a language she speaks, but doesn't trust yet. Why? Because it's right, he answers. And because we're in this together, even if we got shoved into it. An hour later, they're riding Luke on his bay gelding, Amara on the calm little Mari he uses for packs. She sits a saddle like she was born to it. You ride good? He says without thinking. My husband taught me, she answers. And grief walks between them for a few quiet steps. The prairie throws itself around them. Brown grasses like ocean, mountains purple and patient in the distance. A red-tailed hawk writes lazy circles in the sky. It's beautiful, Amara breathes. Hard as sin, but beautiful. Most folks just see hard, Luke says. Takes a certain kind of person to see both. When the town comes up across the flats, Luke feels his jaw set. People have gathered like they got invitations. Faces in windows. Whisper trails. Martha Henderson Tightmouth, Tighter Heart, meets them at the general store door. Well, Luke, she says, sugar over nails. Didn't expect to see you so soon. And with your wife. Morning, Mrs. Henderson, Luke replies. We need supplies. Inside, conversation falls off a cliff. Luke steers Amara to the fabric bolts. Pick what you need. Winter's coming fast. She hesitates. Pride is expensive. Practicality cheaper. She fingers cloth like a musician tests a string. That calico won't last, says a voice Luke actually respects. Eleanor Patterson, Tom's wife, steps in with the kind of grace that doesn't ask permission. Blue wool that will see you through February. Thank you, Amara says, startled by kindness that isn't condescending. My husband says Luke's the best hand he's got, Mrs. Patterson adds, directing it at the room as much as at them. And we look after our people. It's the first time someone says Mrs. Morrison, like it belongs to Amara. Luke doesn't miss the way that word respect lands in her eyes. Strangers stare like theater, but business gets done mostly. Old Charlie Banks at the feed store won't look at Amara until Luke looks at Charlie. The butcher tries to sell second-rate cuts for top-shelf prices and swears the good ones are reserved for folks more regular. They get flour, salt, coffee, a few tools, and a pile of fabric that will become a winter's worth of warmth down at the bank. Blackwood slides out of his office like oil. "Ah, the happy couple," he says loud enough for the boardwalk. "Adapting nicely, I trust." Luke's fists make their own weather, but Amara's hand on his sleeve is a cooler breeze. No difficulties at all. "Mr. Blackwood," she says crisp as starched linen. "Disappointment must be a new feeling for you." His smile flickers. She's already finished with him. Outside, loading their goods, Luke can't help a grin. "You handled him fine. Men like him expect fear," she says. Dignity is a blade they don't see coming. The ride home turns quiet again. Heat rides the noon air. Dust devils play tag, and Luke notices Amara sway faint in the saddle. "When do you last eat proper?" He asks. "I manage." That's not an answer. Silence, then barely audible. 3 days before the wedding. Sold what was left to pay for the dress. Luke swears under his breath and hates that the road back from his mistakes runs through her hunger. Back at the cabin, he insists on rest, pens the horses, unpacks, and cooks something hot. They eat until the silence between them softens from hard to honest. "Thank you," she says finally. "For today. For standing beside me." "Had to," he says. "We didn't pick this, but here we are. We can make each other miserable, or we can make it work." She watches him across the table. "You're not the man I expected at that church." "What did you expect?" "Bitter. Cruel, maybe," she admits. "Most men would be angry enough to aim all that at me." "I was angry," Luke says. "Still am at Snake Eye, at Blackwood, at the kind of folks who call this entertainment. But not at you. You're the only other person who didn't ask for this." "Victim," she says, tasting the word and rejecting it. "I don't like that. What do you like?" "Survivor," she answers, and the corners of her mouth find a real smile. That night, the floor pallet goes down beside the stove like before, and then she stops him. "Luke, this is foolish. You'll ruin your back." The bed's big enough for two and a blanket between. For propriety. He hesitates, then nods. They set a rolled quilt as a border, like a little river they're both careful not to cross. It's awkward, sure, but the exhaustion of a long day and longer week lays down a heavier blanket. Her breathing evens. Wind worries the cabin. Somewhere outside, a coyote sings to the indifferent moon. Luke stares at the dark and realizes something has shifted. They started as strangers handcuffed by other men's games. Maybe, just maybe, they've stepped 1 inch toward something else. Not love, not even friendship yet, but the beginning of partnership, the first fragile thread pulled through rough cloth. Out on the prairie, storms will come. Men will come. 2 men with kerosene, men with badges, men with papers. But tonight, in a cabin that leaks both wind and light, 2 people who didn't choose each other decide, quietly and without fanfare, not to break. And sometimes, in a Western love story, that's the first real miracle. The first week of married life was a strange rhythm of silence, necessity, and stubborn willpower. Luke woke early, as always, feeding stock before the sun cracked the horizon, the sound of the bay gelding's snort grounding him when everything else felt tilted. Inside, Amara tended the stove with a quiet efficiency. Biscuits in the oven, coffee simmering, movements neat as lines on a ledger. They rarely spoke, but each carried their share of the morning. Luke watched her sometimes, wondering how she kept her chin high in a situation meant to shame them both. Pride, maybe, but it looked like something more. Survival made flesh. She never took more than a bite or 2 at meals, never sat when there was a task left undone. By the end of the week, Luke had made up his mind. She needed supplies, clothes, a sense that she belonged in this cabin, not as a prisoner of circumstance, but as someone with her own claim to a dot. So he hitched the team one morning and told her flatly, "We're riding into town." Her jaw tightened. "I have what I need." "No, you don't," he answered. "Not near enough for winter. And if folks are going to whisper anyway, might as well give them something worthwhile to whisper about." She said nothing, but she saddled the Maori. The ride-in was quiet, except for the creak of leather and the steady forebeat of hooves. The air was crisp, scented with sage and dust. Amara sat tall in the saddle, skirts draped just right, riding like she'd been born to it. Luke found himself sneaking glances, the line of her back, the way the wind pulled strands of hair loose from her bonnet. He caught himself and looked away. "You ride good," he said finally. "My husband taught me." The words were soft, but they carried the weight of a man buried under collapsed earth. Luke regretted opening his mouth. The prairie stretched forever around them, amber waves of grass, purple mountains in the distance. A hawk circled overhead. "Hard country," Amara murmured. "But beautiful." Luke gave a short nod. "Most folks don't see both." By the time they hit the edge of Cheyenne Creek, the word had already spread. Folks leaned out on porches, gathered in knots along the boardwalk, whispering behind palms. Luke kept his shoulders squared and his head high. Amara met it all with a cool dignity that made him feel small and proud at the same time. At Henderson's general store, Martha Henderson herself met them at the door, her mouth pinched in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, Luke Morrison, didn't expect to see you so soon after your wedding." Her gaze slid to Amara like a blade. "And with your wife." Luke's voice stayed level. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson. We need supplies." Inside, the air chilled. Shoppers froze mid-transaction, watching as if they'd stumbled into a traveling show. Luke led Amara straight to the fabric counter. "Pick what you need," he told her. "And don't skimp." Her fingers trailed along bolts of calico and wool, pausing with the hesitation of someone who'd always had to count pennies. Then, from behind, another voice cut through. "That calico's not worth the thread in it. Blue wool there will last." Eleanor Patterson, Tom's wife, stood there with calm authority. Her gaze was steady, not pitying. "That's what I'd buy." "Thank you, ma'am," Amara said, surprised. "My husband speaks highly of Luke," Eleanor continued, raising her voice just enough. "Best hand we've got. And we look after our own." It was the first time anyone in town had said Mrs. Morrison with respect. Luke saw something flicker in Amara's dark eyes, hope, maybe, or the shock of being seen. They made the rounds. At the feed store, old Charlie Banks tried to dodge serving them until Luke's stare pinned him still. At the butcher's, the best cuts were suddenly spoken for, though Luke saw them right there in the case. They left with second-rate bacon and salted pork anyway. Folks muttered in their wake, but they muttered quieter when Luke squared his shoulders. The last stop was the bank. Blackwood himself slithered out, oily smile in place. "Ah, the happy couple," he said loudly, as if the whole town needed reminding. "Settling in nicely, I hope." Luke's fists balled. Before he could spit fire, Amara touched his sleeve lightly, her first voluntary contact since the vows. Her voice was smooth as river stone. "No difficulties, Mr. Blackwood. In fact, we're quite content. I imagine disappointment doesn't sit easy with you." The banker's smirk faltered for just a blink before sliding back on. But Luke caught it, and the sight of it warmed him. Outside, loading the wagon, he shook his head in admiration. That was well played. "Men like him expect fear," Amara answered. "But dignity cuts sharper." The sun was high and merciless when they turned back home. Heat shimmered over the prairie. Dust rose in little devils around the horse's legs. Amara rode silent, but Luke noticed her sway. Just a bit. "When's the last time you ate proper?" he asked. I manage fine. That's not an answer. For a long stretch, she said nothing. Then, so quiet he almost missed it. 3 days before the wedding, I sold most of my stores for the dress. Luke cursed under his breath. Guilt hit harder than whiskey ever had. He pushed the team harder, and by the time they rattled into the yard, his jaw was set in stone. Rest, he told her. I'll handle the stock. She looked like she might argue, then simply nodded. That night, he cooked from their new supplies biscuits, bacon, beans, and she ate in silence, but with an appetite that told him more than words. The tension at the table wasn't gone, but it had shifted, like a storm cloud breaking into rain. Thank you, she said softly when the dishes were cleared. For today, for standing up with me. Luke leaned back, weary, meeting her gaze. We didn't pick this, but we're here. We can either make each other's lives hell, or try to make it work. Her lips pressed, then eased. You're not the man I expected at the altar. What did you expect? Anger, bitterness, maybe cruelty. She paused. Most men would have turned it on me. I was angry, he admitted. Still am. At Snake Eye, at Blackwood. But not at you. You didn't choose this any more than I did. She studied him for a long moment. Victim, she said finally. I don't like that word. It tastes like weakness. What do you prefer? Her first real smile bloomed, small but alive. Survivor. That night, when Luke spread his pallet on the floor by the stove, Amara's voice stopped him. This is foolish. You'll ruin your back. The bed is wide enough. A blanket down the middle, for propriety. He froze, then nodded. They laid the quilt like a boundary, each claiming their own side. At first it was awkward, the rustle of cloth, the sound of breathing, but exhaustion soon won. Lying there, Luke stared at the rafters, listening to her breath even out. And he knew something had shifted. They weren't friends. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, they weren't enemies either. Out beyond the cabin walls, coyotes howled, wind rattled shingles, and somewhere the prairie slept. Inside, two unwilling partners lay inches apart, bound by law, judged by neighbors, but quietly, just quietly beginning to choose survival together. And that, Luke thought as sleep took him, might be the first step towards something neither of them had dared imagine. The days settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and strange. Luke rose before dawn, feeding horses and checking fence lines. Amara managed the cabin cooking, mending, and slowly transforming the drafty shack into something that hinted at a home. They spoke little at first, words saved for necessity, but silence no longer carried the sharp edge of strangers forced together. It was beginning to soften, like a rope worn smooth by daily use. Still, the prairie had its way of testing people. One morning, while Luke was out cutting posts, he spotted dust on the horizon, a lone rider pushing hard. He set his hat low and leaned against the fence rail until the horse thundered close enough to identify the man. Tom Patterson, his employer, face lined with sun and worry. Morrison, Patterson called as he pulled up, chest heaving. You best come into town. Trouble's brewing. Luke wiped his brow. What kind of trouble? The kind with cards and whiskey at the bottom of it. Snake Eye's been talking. Telling folks the marriage is a joke, a bet. He's stirring the pot for all it's worth. Luke's jaw clenched. Most folks were there that night. They know, but talk spreads faster than truth. Patterson leaned in, lowering his voice. And Blackwood's pressing. Says if Amara can't pay her note in full, he'll contest the marriage as invalid. Says you two are play-acting. The news sat heavy, but not surprising. Figures. Snake Eye never plays a hand unless the deck's stacked. You'll need to stand up to it. Both of you. Or they'll eat you alive. That evening, Luke told Amara by the fire. She was piecing fabric for a quilt, stitches neat and deliberate, like she could sew strength into every square. Her hands paused, needle hovering. So the game continues. Looks like, Luke said. We can fight it. But we've got to do it together. Her eyes lifted to his, dark and steady. Do you want to fight it, Luke? Or walk away? Walk where? Back to being the man who drank away his wages and let other folks decide his fate? He shook his head. No, I'm not proud of how this started. But I'll be damned if I let Snake Eye and Blackwood write the ending. For the first time, her gaze softened. Then we fight. The very next Sunday, they walked into town side by side. The church was crowded. Word of Snake Eye's boasting had pulled even the lapsed faithful into pews. Reverend Mills cleared his throat nervously as Luke and Amara took their seats. Whispers rippled like wind through wheat. When service ended, Snake Eye was waiting on the boardwalk, cigar between his teeth, grin carved out of arrogance. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, he drawled, dripping mockery. How's married life treating you? Separate beds, I hear. Luke stepped forward before Amara could answer, his voice calm but loud enough for the crowd. You hear wrong. You always do when you're not holding the cards. My wife and I live under one roof, share one table, and work the land together. That's more than you can say about your kind of promises. Gasps and chuckles stirred. Snake Eye's grin faltered, but he recovered fast. Pretty words, Morrison. But pretty words don't pay the banker. What'll you do when Blackwood comes calling? Amara's voice sliced in, clear and sharp. We'll pay. With sweat, with work, with dignity. That's currency you'll never hold, Mr. Sullivan. Her use of his real name, not his nickname, drew a ripple of laughter that cut deeper than any insult. For a moment, the gambler's mask cracked. Then he spat to the side and stalked off. Blackwood, watching from across the street, narrowed his eyes. Luke knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, the town had seen them stand together, not as a joke, but as a pair. The next weeks tested that bond. Work was endless, mending fences, hauling water, breaking ground for spring planting. Luke was strong, but Amara worked alongside him without complaint, sleeves rolled, hands blistered. He tried once to send her inside to rest. She'd shot him a look fierce enough to stop a charging bull. I'm no porcelain doll, she'd said, and that was the end of it. At night, she stitched quilts by lamplight while he carved new handles for tools. The line of blankets still separated their halves of the bed, but conversation began to creep across it. Little things at first, memories of childhood, scraps of songs, talk of weather and harvest. Slowly, cautiously, trust sprouted like the first green shoots after winter. One evening, a storm blew in fierce and sudden. Wind howled, rain battered the roof, and lightning split the sky so bright it lit the cabin like day. Luke found Amara standing at the window, watching the storm with an expression caught between awe and fear. First big one you've seen out here? He asked. She nodded. Back home, storms were heavy, but not like this. This feels alive. He came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. Out here, everything feels alive. Storms, coyotes, the land itself. It's why some folks can't stay. But for the ones who can. He stopped, not sure what he meant to say. For the ones who can, she echoed softly, finishing the thought with her own weight. By late summer, talk in town had shifted. Folks still whispered, but more of them spoke Amara's name without the curl of contempt. Eleanor Patterson came by with a basket of apples. Old Charlie Banks grudgingly sold Luke seed at fair price. Even Martha Henderson nodded curtly when they passed on the street. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was something. Respect, maybe. Earned the hard way. One night, As the prairie cooled under a wide silver moon, Luke sat on the porch steps, hat tilted back, guitar in his lap. He strummed absent-mindedly, rough chords carrying into the night. Amara stepped out, quilt draped over her shoulders. "Didn't know you played," she said. "Not well," he admitted. "But enough to pass the time." She sat beside him, listening. When he finished, she surprised him with a song of her own, an old spiritual her mother used to sing. Her voice was low, rich, filled with sorrow and strength. The notes carried across the land like prayer. When she finished, silence wrapped them both, heavy and holy. Luke swallowed. "That was beautiful. It's survival," she said simply. When all else was taken, songs remained. He nodded, staring out at the horizon where the land met the stars. For the first time, he realized he wasn't thinking about escape or whiskey or regret. He was thinking about tomorrow, about planting seed, about the sound of her voice carrying through the walls of this rough little cabin. Maybe, he thought, this forced union wasn't just a chain. Maybe it was the start of something worth building, not something real. But in Cheyenne Creek, peace never lasted. The morning after that song, a rider brought word. Blackwood had filed papers in Cheyenne. He meant to seize the Johnson land on grounds the marriage wasn't valid. And Snake Eye, ever the shadow in the corner, had promised the whole town a spectacle when the court came to session. Luke set down his coffee cup, jaw hard as iron. Amara's eyes met his across the table, steady, unafraid. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The letter arrived on a gray morning, tucked into the hands of a dusty rider who wanted no part of the message he carried. Luke opened it at the table while Amara watched, her fingers tight around a coffee cup. The words were simple, stamped with Blackwood's seal. Territorial Court will review the matter of Johnson acreage and Morrison marriage contract. Appear in Cheyenne 1 month. Hence. Luke set it down slowly. So it's official. Blackwood means to take the land. Amara's jaw tightened, but her voice was calm. Then we'll go and face him. Her steadiness impressed him. She wasn't cowed, wasn't frightened, not outwardly, anyway. But he knew the weight she carried. This wasn't just about land. It was about her dignity, her survival, her right to exist without being someone's property. The weeks that followed were heavy with preparation. Luke worked longer hours on Patterson's spread, stacking wages away for the journey. Amara stitched until her fingers ached, piecing together quilts she intended to sell. At night, the cabin glowed with lamplight, fabric scraps scattered like fallen leaves, Luke sharpening tools in the corner. One evening, he finally said what had been sitting on his tongue. "Amara, when we stand before the court, they'll ask questions. They'll want proof this marriage is real." She looked up from her sewing, eyes narrowing. "You mean they'll want proof we share more than a roof?" His ears burned, but he didn't look away. "That's what they'll say. Blackwood will claim it's a sham, a trick to save the land. And you?" She asked quietly. "What do you say?" Luke rubbed a calloused thumb along the table's edge. "I say, I didn't choose this start. Neither did you. But since that day, we've been living honest. Working, eating, standing up together. That's as real as any marriage I've seen." For a long moment, she studied him. Then she nodded once, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Then that's what we tell them. The truth." Word spread fast, as always. Snake Eye fanned the fire, boasting in the saloon that he'd see Luke humiliated on the witness stand. Blackwood smiled thin and oily, promising foreclosure was all but certain. But something else stirred too. Eleanor Patterson visited again, leaving flour and sugar on the table as if by accident. Tom Patterson told Luke not to worry about missing a week's work. Even old Charlie Banks muttered that maybe, just maybe, Morrison wasn't such a fool after all. The whispers weren't all cruel anymore. Some had begun to shift. On the last Sunday before the trip, Reverend Mills surprised the congregation. After service, he cleared his throat and said, "I know folks like to talk about bets and games, but I'll tell you plain, I've watched this marriage, and I see two people carrying themselves with more decency than most. That counts for something in the eyes of God, whether or not it counts in the eyes of the court." Luke saw Amara's chin lift a little higher. For once, whispers in the pews bent toward respect. The morning they set out for Cheyenne, frost silvered the grass. Amara wore the blue wool Eleanor had urged her to buy, a shawl over her shoulders, hair braided neat. Luke harnessed the team, every buckle checked twice, as though preparation alone could steady his nerves. The road to Cheyenne was long 3 days of rattling wheels, hard campfires, and the endless sky pressing down. They spoke more on that trail than in the month before. Stories surfaced. Luke's boyhood in Missouri, Amara's memories of Georgia, her father teaching her to sing against sorrow, his mother teaching him to rope before he could red dot at night. By the fire, she sang soft while he strummed his guitar. A prairie seemed to lean in to listen. And when silence came, it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. Cheyenne was a different world. Brick buildings, lawmen on every corner, and the courthouse rising like a fortress in the heart of town. They took a room in a modest boarding house, separate cots but shared determination. The morning of the hearing, Luke pulled on his best shirt and brushed the dust from his hat. Amara stood before the small mirror, steady hands tying her shawl. Her reflection caught his, and for a moment neither looked away. "We're ready," she said simply. The courtroom smelled of ink and old wood. Blackwood sat smug with his lawyer, papers stacked high. Snake Eye lounged in the back, grinning like a man who'd bet on the outcome. Luke and Amara sat side by side, their presence alone sparking murmurs. The judge, a stern man with iron hair, called the matter to order. Blackwood's lawyer rose, voice slick as oil. "Your Honor, this so-called marriage is a mockery, a gambler's jest, a saloon spectacle. Mrs. Johnson was coerced, and Mr. Morrison seeks only to block foreclosure with this sham." Luke's fists clenched, but Amara laid a calm hand on his arm. Then the judge turned to them. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison, is this true? Was your marriage forced?" The room held its breath. Amara stood slowly, back straight, voice clear. "I did not choose the manner of my wedding, Your Honor. That much is true. But since that day, I have chosen every step. I choose to stand beside this man. I choose to build a life with him. And I choose to keep the land my husband and I work together. That is no sham." Her words struck like a hammer in the quiet hall. Even Snake Eye's grin slipped. Luke rose next. "I was a fool that night, Your Honor. I lost more than money. But I won something I didn't deserve, a woman stronger than any I've known. I won't lie, it started wrong. But every day since, we've lived honest. If that ain't a marriage, I don't know what is." The judge leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes sharp as nails. Truth spoken plain is rare in this room. "I'll consider it." As they left the courthouse, townsfolk and strangers alike parted to let them pass. Some tipped their hats. Some only stared. But Luke felt the shift in the air dotted his side. Amara walked tall, her shawl catching the wind like a banner. For the first time, Luke thought they looked less like pawns in someone else's game, and more like partners marching into their own. But Snake Eye wasn't done. His eyes burned from the back of the crowd, and Luke knew the fight had only begun. Because in the West, justice was never just a matter of law, that it was survival, that it was love tested by fire, and fire was coming. The judge's words echoed in Luke's head all the way back to the boarding house. "I'll consider it." No ruling, no verdict, just a delay. For a man like Blackwood, delay was a weapon. Time gave him space to maneuver, to whisper in the right ears, to grease the right palms. Luke knew it. So did Amara. Back in their small rented room, she folded her shawl with neat precision, movement steady, though her eyes betrayed fatigue. "They're not finished," she said softly. "No," Luke admitted, leaning against the window frame. Outside, Cheyenne bustled, wagons rattling, bells clanging, men shouting deals. Life carried on, indifferent to the storm hanging over their heads. "Blackwood won't quit until he's taken everything." Her gaze met his. "Then we don't quit either." The journey home was heavier. The prairie rolled out endless, but the air seemed charged, as though the land itself knew a reckoning was coming. On the second night, camped under a sky freckled with stars, Luke sat by the fire sharpening his knife. Amara hummed while stitching a tear in her dress. "Amara," Luke said at last, breaking the rhythm of crackling firewood. "Back in that courtroom you said you chose to stand beside me. Did you mean it?" Her hands stilled. For a long time, only the night answered, coyotes yipping in the distance. Then she lifted her head. "Yes, I did. Not because of the bet. Not because of the law. Because you've treated me like more than a debt to be collected. That matters." Luke swallowed hard, more rattled by her honesty than he'd been by any poker hand. He managed a small smile. "Guess I'll have to work at deserving it." Then, the firelight caught her face just so, softening the lines carved by hardship. She looked away first, returning to her stitching, but Luke knew something had shifted. When they rolled back into Cheyenne Creek, the town met them with hungry eyes. Snake Eye was already holding court in the saloon, boasting of the coming foreclosure. Blackwood strutted about, as though the land were already his. Yet in quieter corners, Luke noticed something else, nods of respect, neighbors who offered greetings instead of glares. Eleanor Patterson stopped him on the boardwalk, pressing a loaf of fresh bread into his hands. "Stand firm, Luke," she said. "There's more of us rooting for you than you think." It wasn't victory, but it was a start. The days that followed turned into a grind of work and tension. Luke threw himself into the ranch, building fence lines, mending tack, putting away every dime he earned. Amara stretched supplies with a skill born of years of scarcity, sewing clothes from scraps, trading quilts for sugar or coffee. Together they made do, side by side, proving daily that their life wasn't a sham, but a hard-earned partnership. But the enemy never rested. One evening, returning from a long day on the range, Luke found smoke curling on the horizon near their cabin. He spurred the bay hard, fear clawing his chest. The cabin still stood, but the barn smoldered, black timbers collapsing inward. Chickens scattered in the dust. Amara stood nearby, face streaked with soot, a bucket still in her hands. "They came riding hard," she said before he could speak. "3 men. I didn't see faces. They threw torches and laughed when it caught. I couldn't save it all." Her voice shook, but her eyes blazed steady. Luke dismounted, fists trembling. He knew whose hand was behind it. Blackwood wouldn't dirty his own boots, but Snake Eye had plenty of shadows to call upon. "I'll rebuild it," Luke vowed. "Better than before." Amara's chin lifted. "We will rebuild it." Reconstruction became their war cry. Neighbors came Tom Patterson with spare lumber, Eleanor with a wagon team, even old Charlie Banks grumbling but hauling nails. Together they raised new walls, hammered new beams, the sound of defiance ringing louder than any laughter in the saloon. For Luke, it was a revelation. In the past, he would have drowned loss in whiskey, let bitterness rot him from inside. But with Amara beside him, he worked with a steadiness he didn't know he had. Each plank set in place wasn't just wood. It was proof that they couldn't be broken so easily. At night, exhausted, they shared bread and beans on the porch. The quilt barrier still divided their bed, but conversation now came easy, and laughter, real laughter, began to slip in between the cracks of their hard days. One afternoon, as the barn neared completion, Snake Eye rode up bold as brass, cigar between his teeth, 2 rough riders flanking him. He tipped his hat mockingly. "Fine barn you're building, Morrison. Shame if the court says you won't own it long." Luke stepped down from the roof, hammer in hand. "You had something to do with the last fire?" Snake Eye grinned. "Wouldn't waste good whiskey on denying it. But see, accidents happen. And some folks don't take kindly to pretenders." Luke's knuckles whitened around the hammer. But before he could speak, Amara stepped forward, her voice cutting sharp. "We're not pretenders, Mr. Sullivan. We're builders. Every board here is proof of it. And when the court sees the truth, your laughter will be the only thing that burns." The men shifted uncomfortably at her words. Snake Eye sneered, but Luke saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. With a scoff, he jerked his reins and rode off, dust rising behind him. Luke turned to Amara, admiration raw in his gaze. "You stared him down like he was nothing." "He is nothing," she said simply. "A man who thinks cruelty makes him strong. But strength looks different." Luke nodded, chest tight with something he didn't want to name yet. That night, after the barn was finally roofed and the animals settled, they stood together under a wide Wyoming sky. The stars stretched endless, cold and bright, and the wind carried the scent of pine from distant hills. "Thank you," Luke said quietly. "For what?" "For standing with me. For not letting them win." Her eyes met his in the starlight. "We're standing together, Luke. That's the only way we win." For a long moment, the world hushed around them. Then, without planning, without words, they both looked away, each carrying the same unspoken thought. Maybe this marriage, born of a cruel bet, was becoming something else, not something real, something worth fighting for. But the fight wasn't finished. Blackwood had power. Snake Eye had fire. And in the West, men with power rarely quit without blood. The storm was gathering. And Luke and Amara, bound by chance, forged by struggle, would have to face it together. The storm broke sooner than either of them expected. It came not with fire this time, but with paper. A deputy rode up one morning, dust on his badge, a folded writ in his hand. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison," he said, clearing his throat. "The court in Cheyenne's ruled temporary injunction. Blackwood's motion to foreclose is granted pending final hearing." Luke's jaw went tight. "What does that mean?" The deputy shifted, uncomfortable. "Means you can stay for now, but legally the land's in question. Blackwood can send his men to inspect, to assess value. If they want to make trouble, they got license." Amara's face was calm, but her hands curled around her apron. "So we've no protection." The deputy gave a shrug that said more than words. Protection was for men with money. He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving silence in his wake. Luke kicked the post rail hard enough to send it rattling. Damn him. He won't stop till he owns every inch of this valley. Amara's voice came low but firm. Then we hold on. We don't give him cause to say we quit. That evening, Luke rode to the saloon. He hadn't touched whiskey in weeks. Amara's steady presence had been enough to keep him from the bottle. But tonight, he needed answers. The Golden Horseshoe was thick with smoke and laughter, and Snake Eye sat at his usual table, shuffling cards like a magician. "Evening, Morrison," the gambler drawled. "Heard about the injunction. Seems your marriage wasn't the winning hand you thought." Luke walked up slow, meeting his eyes. "You burned my barn. You spread your lies. Now you've got your claws in the court. What's next, Snake? You want my blood too?" The gambler smiled thin, eyes glinting. "Wouldn't be the first time a cowboy bled for pride. But I'm just a messenger. Blackwood's the one who writes the rules. I only deal the cards." Luke leaned across the table, his voice low and even. Then you tell Blackwood this. We're not folding. Not now, not ever. Snake Eye chuckled, but there was tension in his jaw. Careful, Morrison. Pride can get a man killed. Luke straightened, hat brim low. So can cowardice. He turned and walked out, leaving the saloon buzzing. Back at the cabin, Amara was waiting. She'd set bread on the table, but hadn't touched it. You went to him, she said flatly. I had to. Luke pulled off his hat, running a hand through his hair. He's working with Blackwood, plain as day. They mean to starve us out. And what did you gain by threatening a snake in his own den? Her eyes were sharp, but behind them he saw fear for him, not herself. Luke sighed. Maybe nothing. Maybe just letting him know I won't scare easy. Amara's gaze softened, though her words stayed hard. Then don't waste your courage in his saloon. Save it for the fight that matters. He nodded. She was right. She usually was. The fight came 2 nights later. Luke woke to hoofbeats pounding in the dark. He was on his feet before his mind caught up, shotgun in hand. Amara was already at the window, eyes wide but steady. Lanterns bobbed outside, 6 riders circling, torches lit. Blackwood's men, Luke growled. They dismounted, voices jeering, one calling out, Time's up, Morrison. Pack your things and clear out before the law clears you out. Luke stepped onto the porch, shotgun steady. This land's ours. You've no claim till the court says otherwise. A tall man with a scar over his eye laughed, brandishing his torch. Court already spoke, Cowboy. We're just helping it along. He pitched the torch toward the new barn dot. It landed in the dirt short of the wall, flames sputtering. But the message was clear. Luke raised the shotgun. Next man throws fire. I'll put him down. Tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Hooves stamped, torches flared. Then Amara stepped onto the porch beside him, quilt shawl around her shoulders, her voice ringing like a bell. You come with fire, but you leave with shame. Every man here knows the law hasn't spoken final. And every man here knows Morrison isn't alone. The riders shifted, uneasy. Nobody wanted to be the one to gun down a woman in plain sight. The scarred man spat, muttered a curse, and swung back into the saddle. This ain't over. Dust and hoofbeats faded into the night. Luke lowered the shotgun slowly, chest tight with fury and relief. You could have been killed, he said, voice hoarse. So could you, Amara answered simply. But we stood together. That's why they rode off. In the days that followed, whispers of the standoff spread. Some folks called Luke reckless, a hothead bound for a pine box. But others more than before spoke of Amara with respect. Stood tall as any rancher's wife, they said. Didn't blink when the guns came out. Eleanor Patterson came by again, this time with blankets and preserves. You're not alone, she told Amara in the kitchen. Blackwood thinks he can buy this town, but some of us know better. That night, when Luke and Amara lay down with the quilt divider between them, the silence was different, softer, warmer. Luke, she said into the dark. Yeah? You told me once you didn't want to be the man who lost everything in whiskey and cards. I don't think you are that man anymore. Luke stared at the rafters, throat tight. Then maybe this marriage has made me better. Better than I deserved. There was no answer, only the sound of her breathing close beside him. But sleep came easier than it had in months. The prairie was quiet, but it was the quiet before a storm. Blackwood had been thwarted, Snake Eye embarrassed. And men like that never forgot. Luke knew the next move wouldn't be fire or threats. It would be something worse. Something cunning. And when it came, he and Amara would need more than courage. They would need each other. The storm didn't come with riders this time. It came dressed in Sunday clothes. Luke and Amara walked into Cheyenne Creek one brisk morning, expecting only to trade eggs and butter at the market. Instead, they found a crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Sheriff Carter stood stiff on the steps, a folded paper in his hand, while Samuel Blackwood, smug as ever, leaned on his cane. "Attention, folks," Carter called, his face grim. By order of the Territorial Court, the property known as Morrison Homestead is under immediate foreclosure pending auction. Effective at once, the crowd erupted, some gasping, some whispering, others smirking at Luke's humiliation. Blackwood tipped his hat toward Amara, his oily smile never touching his eyes. "Business, Mrs. Morrison. Nothing personal." Luke shoved through the throng, fists clenched. "You've stacked the deck from the start." "Careful, Morrison," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Threats against a banker carry weight in a courtroom. But perhaps if your wife saw reason, she might persuade you to settle things quietly." His meaning was plain, filthy, and deliberate. Before Luke could lunge, Amara stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but her eyes blazed. "You think a piece of paper will drive us off land we bled for? You think a system built on bribes and prejudice will make me bow?" She lifted her chin higher. "I was born in chains, Mr. Blackwood. You think your ink and quill frighten me?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few men looked away, shamed. Sheriff Carter cleared his throat. "Auction set for 2 weeks. That's the law." His eyes, however, carried apology. Luke and Amara walked back to their wagon in silence. Not until they'd cleared the edge of town did Luke speak. "I swear to you, Amara, I'll fight this till my dying breath." She reached for his hand, strong and sure. "Then we fight it smart. Rage won't win us a courtroom." But truth might. The following days were a blur of planning. Eleanor Patterson opened her parlor to them, gathering the wives and ranchers sympathetic to their cause. "Hawthorne's gone too far," she said firmly. "First he tried to break you with torches. Now he's twisting the law. If he wins here, the rest of us are next." They began compiling evidence. Broken fences, burned haystacks, witnesses of Hawthorne's riders trespassing, and Amara calm, meticulous sat each night by lamplight, writing every detail into ledgers. Luke watched her once, quill scratching across paper, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up at him finally. "What?" "Nothing," he said softly. "Just thinking how you hold us together. How you've turned my cabin into something more than 4 walls." Her eyes softened. "We're not surviving, Luke. We're building. And that's what terrifies men like Blackwood and Hawthorne." On the morning of the auction, Cheyenne Creek was alive with gossip. The courthouse steps bustled with townsfolk eager to see the spectacle. Blackwood arrived in a fine carriage, while Snake Eye Sullivan lounged nearby, rolling cards across his fingers. Hawthorne himself had returned, looming like a storm cloud beside his lawyers. Luke and Amara entered on foot, side by side, their clothes plain but neat. They didn't look beaten, they looked unbroken. The judge, an older man with a reputation for business-friendly rulings, took his seat. "This hearing will determine rightful ownership of the Morrison property. Let the bidding commence." Blackwood rose first, offering a sum so large the room murmured in awe. Hawthorne's bid followed, even higher. The game was rigged from the start. Then a clear voice cut through the room. "Objection, Your Honor." Amara stood, her ledger in hand. "Before you auction a man's home, perhaps the court should hear how these men sought to steal it through fraud and intimidation." The judge frowned. "This is highly irregular." Sheriff Carter stepped forward. "I'll vouch for her, Judge. I've seen the threats myself. And I'll swear on the good book those riders meant arson." The courtroom buzzed. Hawthorne's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Baseless claims? From a woman with no standing in this court." Amara's voice didn't waver. "Standing? My back bears more weight of standing than your whole life of sitting in offices. I've plowed fields, buried husbands, and faced riders with guns. I have every right to stand here. For the first time, silence fell on Hawthorne's side. The judge, sweating now under so many eyes, ordered testimony. One by one, neighbors came forward. Tom Patterson swearing to cut fences, Eleanor to whispered threats, even young Sarah testifying to seeing Hawthorne's riders lurking near the Morrison place at night. Snake. I tried to slip out the back, but Luke intercepted him. "You'll speak too," Luke growled, and speak he did half to save his own hide, half because Amara's steady gaze pinned him like a snake on a spear. "Blackwood paid me to set up that poker game," he confessed, voice shaking. "Hawthorne wanted her land. The marriage, the debt, it was all part of the plan." The room erupted in chaos. Hawthorne roared, Blackwood paled, and the judge pounded his gavel till his arm shook. But the truth was out. That night, back at the cabin, Luke and Amara sat in the lamplight. Their future wasn't secure, yet the court's full ruling would take weeks. But the tide had turned. Luke reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "When I lost that bet, I thought I'd lost everything. But looking at you now, Amara, I reckon it was the first time in my life I ever truly won." Her eyes glistened, though her smile was fierce. "Don't speak too soon, Cowboy. We've still got miles to ride in this fight." Luke squeezed her hand gently. "Then we'll ride them together." But Hawthorne wasn't finished. And the last hand he held was the deadliest of all. The next dawn, smoke rose again on the horizon, not from fire, but from the guns of hired killers riding straight for the Morrison homestead. The real battle had only just begun. The riders came fast, their dust cloud rolling across the prairie like thunder before a storm. Luke spotted them first from the fence line. 6, maybe 7 men guns strapped low, faces hard. These weren't farmhands or petty rustlers. They were killers for hire. "Amara!" he shouted, sprinting for the cabin. She was already at the door, rifle in hand, her eyes fierce. "They've come to finish it," she said, voice steady despite the galloping hooves. Luke slammed the door shut and dropped the bar across it. "Then we make our stand." The first shots shattered glass, wood splinters flying. Amara ducked low, firing through a crack in the shutters. One rider toppled, his horse bolting without him. Luke returned fire from the opposite window, the recoil rattling his shoulder. "Stay low!" He barked, but Amara was already moving, reloading with quick, practiced hands. "You stay low," she shot back. Her jaw was set like granite, her courage unshakable. Bullets tore through the siding, the cabin groaning under the assault. Then came the sound Luke dreaded, the crackle of fire. One of the men had lobbed a torch into the barn. A terrified bawl of cattle carried through the smoke. Luke's heart clenched. Their livelihood? Their animals? Without them, they'd starve come winter. "I'll cover you," Amara said sharply, reading his thoughts. "Get to the barn." "No, there's no time." She snapped and fired again through the window, dropping another rider. Luke cursed, then grabbed his shotgun and bolted out the back door, staying low in the sagebrush. He circled wide, smoke searing his lungs, and reached the barn. Flames licked the dry boards, but hadn't taken hold yet. He tore off his coat and beat at the fire until his arms ached. A shout rose behind him. One of the gunmen had spotted him. Luke spun, firing instinctively. The man crumpled into the dirt back in the cabin. Amara stood her ground. She was outnumbered, but her aim was true. Another rider fell, clutching his side. But then the hammer of her rifle clicked empty. She reached for the shotgun, only to hear boots on the porch. The door shuddered as a heavy shoulder slammed against it. Once, twice, a third blow, and the bar cracked. Amara braced herself, shotgun raised. The door burst inward, and the scarred man Luke had faced weeks before stormed through. His grin was all malice. "Got you now, gal?" he snarled, leveling his revolver. Before he could fire, Amara squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared, and the man flew backward into the dirt. Still Dot, she reloaded with shaking hands, breath ragged, but her eyes burned with fire. Luke stumbled back from the barn, smoke-streaked and coughing, but alive. The barn still stood, smoldering but saved. He raised his gun at the last two riders circling near the well. "You're finished," he bellowed. But before he could fire, a fresh sound split the air, the thunder of many more hooves. Luke's heart clenched, then soared Dot from the ridge, poured a line of riders. Tom Patterson at the front, Eleanor in a wagon with the ranch wives armed with rifles, Sheriff Carter with a full posse behind him. The Homesteaders Association had come. "Drop your guns," Carter thundered. "You're outnumbered and out of time." The remaining riders froze. Outgunned, they let their weapons fall. The posse swarmed, ropes at the ready, hauling them down. Luke staggered to the porch, where Amara stood framed in smoke and sunlight, her shoulders squared, her shotgun steady. She looked like a queen holding court in the ruins of her castle. He touched her arm, his voice rough. "You all right?" Her lips trembled, but she nodded. We stood, together. The aftermath stretched long into evening. The dead were carried away, the wounded treated. Sheriff Carter rode to town to wire the marshal. Patterson clapped Luke on the back. "You've done more than defend your land, son. You've lit a fire under this valley. Folks won't bow to Hawthorne anymore." Luke looked at Amara, who was comforting a frightened calf she'd led from the barn. Pride and love swelled in his chest. "Wasn't me alone," he said. "Never was." Weeks later, the courtroom in Cheyenne was packed once more. But this time, the outcome was different. With witness after witness testifying to Hawthorne's campaign of violence, with Snake Eye's reluctant confession, with Amara's meticulous ledgers presented as evidence, the judge's ruling came swift. All claims against the Morrison homestead are null. Hawthorne's assets are seized. "And let the record show," the judge intoned, "this court recognizes the Cheyenne Valley Homesteaders Association as lawful and binding." The gavel fell, and the room erupted in cheers. Luke pulled Amara into his arms, heedless of the crowd. "It's over," he whispered. "No," she corrected softly, her eyes shining. "It's beginning." That spring, wildflowers carpeted the valley. The association thrived. Farms flourished without Hawthorne's shadow looming overhead. And in the Morrison cabin, joy blossomed in a new way. Amara placed a small bundle in Luke's arms one bright morning. "Meet Hope," she said, tears shining. The baby's tiny hand curled around Luke's finger, and he felt something break and mend inside all at once. He kissed Amara's brow. "Our future," he murmured. "Born free, born strong." That night, as the prairie stars blazed overhead, Luke and Amara stood together on their porch. The baby slept inside, safe in a cradle carved by Wilhelm Schmidt, gifted by the community they had fought to build. Luke slipped his arm around his wife. "I lost a bet, Amara," he said quietly. "But in losing, I won the life I never dreamed I'd have." She leaned against him, her smile soft and fierce. "And I found a partner worth every fight, worth every mile." Together, they looked out at the land they had nearly lost, the land they had saved. Their story, once meant as humiliation, had become a legend of love and defiance. Cowboy and a woman, once written off as less. Now husband and wife, partners, survivors, builders of a future. The Wild West was hard, unforgiving. But here, on this patch of Wyoming earth, love had not only survived, it had triumphed, and it would echo for generations.